There is a peculiar, almost haunting paradox in the way modern society treats the giant weapons of the 20th century. Millions of tourists line up every year along coastal parkways and city piers to step onto the polished wooden flight decks of massive steel warships, paying for admission, eating ice cream on the hangar deck, and pointing camera lenses down corridors where young men once bled, prayed, and suffocated in the dark. We turn floating cities of violence into family parks. But if you stand quiet enough on the lowest deck of a preserved aircraft carrier, beneath 30,000 tons of cold, riveted steel, past the gift shops and the velvet ropes, you can still feel the weight of an epoch. You can hear the low, deep creak of a hull resting in mud, carrying the silent weight of thousands of ghosts. During the height of the Pacific War, the United States Navy built 24 Essex-Class aircraft carriers, the most formidable fleet of standardized fleet carriers ever assembled in human history. They were the steel engines that broke the back of the Imperial Japanese Navy, stretching nearly 900 feet from stem to stern, powered by massive boilers that consumed hundreds of thousands of gallons of heavy fuel oil, and crewed by nearly 3,000 young men, many of whom had never seen an ocean before stepping aboard. They carried the air war across millions of square miles of open ocean, surviving typhoons, torpedo strikes, and the desperate, flaming impacts of Japanese kamikaze aircraft. After World War II, as the jet age dawned and the Cold War escalated into hot conflicts across Asia, these ships were rebuilt, modified, and sent back to sea. They served through the freezing carrier operations off the Korean peninsula and launched thousands of combat sorties into the anti-aircraft riddled skies of Vietnam. They recovered NASA's first space capsules from the vast blue solitude of the ocean, bridging the gap between naval warfare and the stars. Today, out of those 24 Leviathans that once projected American industrial power across the globe, 20 have vanished. They were ripped apart by blowtorches in dry docks from Brownsville to Philadelphia, reduced to scrap metal, or intentionally blasted beneath the surface of the sea to serve as artificial reefs or live fire targets. Only 4 remain afloat on the face of the earth. 4 steel monuments preserved as museum ships, anchored in 4 corners of the American coastline. To understand where these 4 survivors are today, one must walk their decks not as tourists, but as witnesses to the human cost forged into their armor plate. The first of these surviving giants rests at Patriots Point in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, gazing silently across the calm water toward the skyline of historic Charleston, the USS Yorktown, designated CV-10. To know the Yorktown is to understand a ship born out of grief and defiance. When her keel was laid at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, she was not supposed to bear the name Yorktown at all. She was originally christened the Bonhomme Richard, but in June 1942, during the pivotal Battle of Midway, the original USS Yorktown, CV-5, was struck by Japanese air attacks and finished off by a submarine torpedo, sinking into the deep Pacific abyss. The workers in Virginia immediately requested permission to rename the newborn carrier under construction on their slipways. They would build a new Yorktown, faster, larger, and far more lethal, to avenge the lost ship. Commissioned in April 1943 under the command of Captain Joseph J. Clark, a hard-driving Oklahoma-born officer who became known to his crew as Jocko, the new Yorktown rushed into the Pacific fighting. Clark was a stern disciplinarian who understood that in the vast, unforgiving theater of naval aviation, meticulous precision meant the difference between life and death. On board the Yorktown, flight deck crews worked in a frenzy of gasoline fumes, roaring radial engines and spinning propellers. Men like aviation machinists mate third-class William Red Miller stood on the windswept deck in color-coded jerseys, guiding Hellcat fighters into the arresting gear as the ship pitched in heavy seas. A single slip of a foot or a missed signal meant being sliced apart by a spinning prop, or hurled overboard into a wake that no ship could turn fast enough to search. In February 1944, during Operation Hailstone, the crushing strike against the Japanese naval fortress at Truk Lagoon, Yorktown's air group struck deep into enemy strongholds. But the true test of her structural resilience came a year later, on March 18, 1945, off the coast of the Japanese home island of Kyushu. A single Japanese dive bomber breached the fleet's defense envelope and dropped a 250-pound armor-piercing bomb directly onto the ship's hangar deck. The bomb tore through the upper steel framing and exploded in the crew quarters, killing 5 men and wounding 26 others. Flames erupted near stored ammunition and aviation fuel lines. On the hangar deck, fire parties charged directly into blinding toxic chemical smoke. Damage control teams, led by men who knew every valve and bulkhead by memory, fought the blazes with mechanical foam while the ship's engines kept her moving at combat speed. They saved the ship in less than an hour, allowing her to continue launching strikes. The Yorktown went on to earn 11 battle stars in World War II. After the war, she was modernized with an angled flight deck and an enclosed hurricane bow, transforming her profile to operate heavy jet aircraft during the Cold War and the Vietnam War. In December 1968, she earned a unique place in human history when she was chosen as the prime recovery ship for Apollo 8, the first manned mission to orbit the moon. On a dim ocean morning in the South Pacific, Yorktown's sailors watched from the railings as the blackened command module splash-landed in the water nearby, carrying astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders safely back to Earth. Decommissioned in 1970, the Yorktown faced the looming shadow of the scrapbreaker's yard. She was saved by a dedicated group of South Carolina veterans and citizens who raised the funds to tow her to Charleston Harbor in 1975. Today, she rests embedded in the silt of Patriots Point. Her survival is still an ongoing battle against time and the salt. The coastal environment relentlessly attacks her steel hull from the outside, while brackish water corrodes her submerged plates. Preserving an 888-foot warship requires constant structural maintenance, sandblasting, and epoxy sealing. Visitors walking her dark engine rooms today can smell the faint, lingering mixture of bunker oil, old paint, and metal, a sensory ghost of the thousands who lived and fought within her steel ribs. 400 miles to the north, anchored against the towering glass and concrete skyline of Manhattan, lies the second surviving sister, the USS Intrepid, CV-11, resting at Pier 86 on the Hudson River. If the Yorktown represents resilience, the Intrepid is a testament to survival through sheer bloody endurance. Among her crew, she earned two affectionate yet grim nicknames, the Fighting Eye and the Evil Eye. The latter moniker arose because Intrepid seemed to draw enemy fire like a lightning rod, absorbing more direct heavy damage than almost any other carrier of her class that survived the war. Commissioned in August 1943, Intrepid was thrust directly into the brutal island-hopping campaigns of the Central Pacific. Her trial by fire began on February 17, 1944, during the attack on Truk Lagoon. Late at night, an Imperial Japanese torpedo bomber slipped low over the water, undetected by early radar, and launched an aerial torpedo that slammed into Intrepid's starboard stern. The explosion ripped open the hull below the waterline, killing 11 crewmen and jamming her massive rudder hard to port. With the ship stuck turning in circles in hostile waters thousands of miles from a major friendly port, her captain, Thomas L. Sprague, executed a brilliant piece of improvised seamanship. He ordered the crew to rig an improvised canvas sail made of heavy deck awnings over the ship's bow. By adjusting the sail area and balancing the speed of her four massive propeller shafts, the crew managed to steer the damaged warship across thousands of miles of open ocean back to Pearl Harbor for emergency repairs. But Intrepid's true ordeal occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf and the subsequent operations off the Philippines in late 1944. It was here that the U.S. Navy confronted a terrifying new tactic, the kamikaze, the special attack units of the Japanese Special Attack Corps, where young pilots deliberately flew explosives-laden aircraft into American ships. On October 29, 1944, a burning kamikaze bore in on Intrepid's port side and slammed into Gun Tub 10, one of her 20mm anti-aircraft mounts. The 10 men crewing that station were steward's mates, sailors like Alonzo Swan, barred by the Navy's segregation policies from serving as gunners, and assigned instead to serve meals and clean officers' quarters. When general quarters sounded, they manned the gun anyway. Swan and his crewmates kept firing as the aircraft closed the final yards, and the impact tore the mount apart, killing 10 of the 20 men stationed there and wounding several more. Swan survived, badly hurt, and 6 of his surviving shipmates were put in for the Navy Cross. The Navy downgraded the award, and it took Swan nearly 50 years and a lawsuit before he finally received his Navy Cross aboard Intrepid in 1993. 1 month later, on November 25th, the sky above Intrepid turned into a wall of flak. Within the span of 5 minutes, Two separate kamikaze aircraft pierced the anti-aircraft barrage and slammed directly into the carrier. The first Zero fighter penetrated the flight deck, its engine tearing deep into the hangar deck before its bomb exploded. Seconds later, a second Japanese fighter, already burning from point-blank anti-aircraft fire, plunged through the deck plating nearby. The dual strikes unleashed a horrific firestorm. Aviation fuel lines ruptured, sending rivers of burning gasoline cascading through the hangar spaces where armed and fueled aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip. 69 sailors lost their lives in a matter of minutes. Intrepid, time and again, her damage control parties extinguished the infernos, patched her flight deck with heavy timber and steel plates, and brought the ship back to port under her own power. By the end of World War II, Intrepid had been struck by a torpedo and multiple kamikaze attacks, earning a reputation as a ship that simply refused to die. Like her sister Yorktown, Intrepid was modernized during the 1950s, with a steam catapult, an angled flight deck, and an enclosed bow, serving as an anti-submarine carrier and deploying for 3 grueling combat tours during the Vietnam War. Her air groups flew thousands of strike missions against targets in North Vietnam, dodging surface-to-air missiles and heavy anti-aircraft fire. She also retrieved Mercury 7 astronaut Scott Carpenter in 1962 and the Gemini 3 astronauts Gus Grissom and John Young in 1965. When she was decommissioned in 1974, she seemed destined for the scrapyard, but New York real estate developer Zachary Fisher stepped forward, establishing the Intrepid Museum Foundation. In 1982, the carrier was permanently moored at Pier 86 along Manhattan's west side. Today, Intrepid rests against the backdrop of Midtown Manhattan. She faces unique urban and environmental preservation challenges. The intense winter storms of the North Atlantic, combined with the heavy tidal currents and industrial silt of the Hudson River, constantly wear away at her underwater hull. In 2006, when the museum attempted to tow Intrepid to a dry dock in Bayonne, New Jersey, for a major restoration, her massive propellers became buried deep in 30 years of accumulated Hudson River mud. It required extensive dredging by the Army Corps of Engineers to free the 40,000-ton carrier. Now fully restored, she houses historic aircraft, the Space Shuttle Enterprise, and the memory of the men who died in her hangar deck fires that autumn. Crossing the continent to the west coast, anchored along the calm, industrial shores of San Francisco Bay at the former Naval Air Station in Alameda, California, sits the third surviving sister, the USS Hornet, CV-12. Like the Yorktown, the Hornet was born out of tragedy. She was originally to be named the Kearsarge, but in October 1942, during the desperate Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the original USS Hornet, CV-8, the famous carrier that had launched the historic Doolittle raid against Tokyo, was crippled by Japanese air attacks and sunk by enemy torpedoes. To honor the lost ship and her crew, the Navy ordered that CV-12, then under construction at Newport News, be renamed Hornet. Commissioned in November 1943 under Captain Miles Browning, the new Hornet quickly proved herself one of the most aggressive and successful warships in the fleet. Joining Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher's famous Fast Carrier Task Force 58, Hornet took part in virtually every major naval engagement of the Pacific War's final phase. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, known historically as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Hornet's fighter pilots smashed incoming Japanese strike formations, destroying dozens of enemy aircraft in a single day. But her most famous tactical operational moment came on the evening of June 20th, 1944. Admiral Mitscher launched an extreme long-range strike against the retreating Japanese fleet at the absolute outer limit of the American aircraft's fuel range. As night fell over the Pacific, hundreds of American planes returned toward the task force, their fuel tanks running dangerously close to empty. Strict wartime blackout doctrines dictated that ships remain entirely dark to prevent Japanese submarines from locating them. But Admiral Mitscher made a legendary decision: turn on the lights. Hornet and her sister carriers threw open their massive searchlights, shooting vertical beams of light into the dark clouds and firing star shells to guide their boys home. Pilots, blinded by fatigue and low on fuel, landed on any carrier deck they could see. On Hornet's flight deck, landing signal officers stood in the dark with glowing paddles, guiding exhausted young aviators onto the deck, while rescue destroyers pulled dozens of downed pilots out of the pitch-black sea. Hornet's war was not fought only against human enemies. She also survived the terrifying power of nature. On June 5, 1945, while operating off the coast of Okinawa, Hornet was caught in the path of Typhoon Connie. The storm generated 90-knot winds and mountainous 60-foot waves. As the carrier slammed into the massive troughs of water, the extreme structural pressure collapsed the forward 25 feet of her armored flight deck, bending the heavy steel plating downward over the bow like a crushed tin can. Despite the severe structural damage, her crew cleared the metal debris at sea, and Hornet continued launching aircraft over her shortened bow until the mission was complete. Following post-war modernization, Hornet served in the Cold War and Vietnam, but her name became immortalized during the Apollo program. On July 24, 1969, Hornet served as the prime recovery ship for Apollo 11. When astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins returned from humanity's first landing on the Moon, their capsule splash-landed in the Pacific, just 13 miles from the Hornet. Navy frogmen retrieved the astronauts, brought them aboard the carrier, and placed them directly into a mobile quarantine facility on Hornet's hangar deck to prevent any potential extraterrestrial pathogens from escaping. President Richard Nixon stood on Hornet's deck, welcoming the three men back to Earth through the small glass window of the quarantine trailer. Just 4 months later, in November 1969, Hornet repeated this historic mission by recovering the crew of Apollo 12. Decommissioned in 1970, Hornet spent nearly 3 decades deteriorating in the mothball fleet in Suisun Bay. Stripped of equipment, her paint peeling, and her hull growing thick with marine life, she was slated for the scrap heap. A dedicated group of citizens formed the aircraft carrier Hornet Foundation, fighting against military bureaucracy to save the ship. In 1998, she opened as the USS Hornet C Air and Space Museum in Alameda, California. Today, Hornet is widely regarded as one of the most original, unrestored, and atmospheric museum ships in the world. Unlike some carriers that have been heavily modified with modern carpeted exhibit halls, stepping down into Hornet's third deck feels like walking directly into 1945 or 1969. The preserved mobile quarantine facility sits on her hangar deck, looking exactly as it did when Armstrong and Aldrin peeked through its window. Still, maintaining a 900-foot warship on a non-profit budget is a daunting, daily struggle against salt erosion and mechanical rust. The ship relies heavily on volunteer Navy veterans and skilled tradesmen who spend weekends painting, welding, and maintaining her vast steel interior to keep history alive. Finally, we travel south to the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, where the fourth surviving sister rests along the beach of Corpus Christi, Texas, the USS Lexington, CV-16. To understand the Lexington currently sitting in Corpus Christi, one must first address a persistent point of historical confusion that misleads thousands of visitors every year. This ship, CV-16, is not the original USS Lexington, CV-2. The original Lexington, affectionately known as Lady Lex, was a massive converted battlecruiser commissioned in 1927. In May 1942, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, the world's first naval battle fought entirely by carrier-based aircraft, the original Lexington was struck by Japanese torpedoes and bombs. Secondary internal explosions ignited her aviation gasoline lines, causing catastrophic internal fires that forced her crew to abandon ship before she was scuttled by American torpedoes. Today, the wreck of the original Lexington, CV-2, rests over 2 miles deep on the floor of the Coral Sea. When the news of CV-2's loss reached the shipyard at Fore River in Quincy, Massachusetts, workers were already constructing an Essex-Class carrier designated as the Cabot. In a gesture of honor and remembrance, the Navy immediately ordered the Cabot to be renamed Lexington. Built in just 14 months, the new Lexington, CV-16, was commissioned in February 1943. Lexington's wartime career became the stuff of legend. Painted in a dark blue-gray camouflage scheme, she struck Japanese bases across the Pacific. On 4 separate occasions, the Japanese government officially announced to the world via state propaganda broadcasts that the USS Lexington had been destroyed and sunk. Time after time, the carrier reappeared in subsequent battles, her air groups striking Japanese positions with deadly effectiveness. This uncanny ability to repeatedly survive heavy damage and reappear in the fight earned her a famous nickname, coined by the infamous Japanese radio broadcaster Tokyo Rose, the Blue Ghost. The crew embraced the name with fierce pride, painting a glowing ghost silhouette on the ship's island. The nickname was tested severely on November 5, 1944, during operations in the Philippines. A Japanese kamikaze pilot targeted Lexington, diving his bomb-laden fighter straight through a wall of defensive fire. The aircraft slammed directly into the base of the carrier's island structure, the fireball tearing through the flight deck and killing 50 sailors while wounding 132 others. Sub-Lieutenant Donald A. Gary, an engineer who would later be awarded the Medal of Honor, rushed into the smoke-filled lower compartments, where dozens of men were trapped behind twisted bulkheads and raging fires. Working in total darkness and suffocating heat, Gary repeatedly navigated the dangerous spaces, locating 47 trapped crewmen and guiding them to safety through a narrow air intake shaft. Through sheer determination, Lexington's crew extinguished the fires and repaired the flight deck, allowing her to resume flight operations. By the end of World War II, Lexington's air group had destroyed over 700 enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground, making her one of the most decorated warships in American history, with 11 battle stars. After the war, while many of her sister ships were gradually retired, Lexington lived an extraordinarily long second life. She was modernized and recommissioned as an attack carrier, then as an anti-submarine carrier, and finally as the U.S. Navy's primary training carrier, CVT-16, stationed at Pensacola, Florida. For decades, virtually every U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard aviator qualified for carrier landings on her angled flight deck. She served continuously until her final decommissioning in November 1991, nearly 50 years after her keel was laid. She was the longest-serving and last active Essex-Class aircraft carrier on the planet. In 1992, Lexington was towed to Corpus Christi, Texas, where she was permanently moored at North Beach as a museum ship. Today, the Blue Ghost rests peacefully in the warm waters of the Gulf. Her presence in Texas is formidable, her massive blue hull visible from across the bay. Like all museum carriers, though, her preservation costs millions in sandblasting, steel replacement, and climate control to keep the humid Gulf air from consuming her frame. When you step back and look at these four surviving sisters, the Yorktown in South Carolina, the Intrepid in New York, the Hornet in California, and the Lexington in Texas, you are looking at the last tangible remnants of a generation that reshaped the world order through sacrifice and industrial scale. 24 of these massive ships were built. 20 went to the scrapper's torch or were plunged into the abyss of the ocean. Only these four remain afloat. As the years pass, the generation that walked these steel passageways under enemy fire is rapidly slipping away into history. The young men who scrubbed these decks, who loaded anti-aircraft guns while the sky burned, and who guided sputtering Hellcats back onto pitching wooden decks in the dark, are almost all gone. Soon, there will be no living voices left to tell us what it smelled like when aviation fuel burned on the hangar deck, or what it felt like when 30,000 tons of steel vibrated beneath your feet at full combat speed. That leaves a real question about historical memory and national legacy. When the last veteran who served on these decks has passed away, what do these giant steel hulls become to us? Are they merely quiet engineering monuments, architectural curiosities from a forgotten era preserved for weekend tourists? Or do they remain something closer to sacred ground, steel hulls that still hold the weight of the men who bled and prayed and died inside them? If you served aboard the Yorktown, the Intrepid, the Hornet, or the Lexington, or if someone in your family walked these passageways during World War II, Korea, or Vietnam, we ask you to leave your story, your ship's name, and your memories in the comments below. Let us ensure that those who lived and died within these four steel giants are never forgotten.